Today's topic is going to be exclusively on nanoscale optics and plasmonics. In particular, how do we decouple fundamental photophysics, and how do they actually help us devise better applications in nanoscale optics? So the broad motivation, as a lot of you might be aware, is conversion of solar energy. Why go after solar? Because in the next hour or so, we'll get more energy from sun than we can consume in an entire year. The scientific problems, though, are this very energetically broad distribution of sunlight that we get as solar energy. Now, this is the best case scenario for silicon with a band gap right at 1.1 electron volt. We have more than a third of energy that's not going to be absorbed in silicon. It's just simply going to be transmitted through. So this is a prime target that I'm going to talk about in today's talk. Of course, there are other problems. The mismatch of the energy of the incident photon and the band gap of the silicon photocell. So right here at 1.1 electron volt, we are going to get very efficient conversion, at least thermodynamically, that every single photon that falls in has exactly the right energy that's required to create the electron-hole pair. We'll get high conversion efficiency. But again, the vast majority of photons here are going to have excess energy than the band gap of silicon photocells, and they're going to lose this energy by thermalization because of these vast series of phonon states available in a typical bulk band gap semiconductor. So this is a big problem that ends up heating the semiconductor photocell. So more than a third of energy here is just going to be dissipated as waste heat. Even generally, the way we consume energy is we use energy as non-renewable sources. We are of the 15 terawatts or so that we actually consume, we emit more than 8 terawatts as waste heat into the environment. So what is the need for this efficient photon upconversion, or if there's a way that we could take at least a very small fraction of this 31% or 33% energy that's not being absorbed in typical photocells, we would be in a pretty good position. So the idea, at least in principle, is simple. Take a solar cell, absorb whatever you can in that semiconductor photocell, and any light that's simply transmitted through would be then upconverted by this upconverter and radiated back as visible or ultraviolet light matched to the band gap of the semiconductor photocell. Now, this is easier said than done. We know photon upconversion is not an easy task, and so I'm going to talk about some of the strategies using nanoscale optics, particularly photon upconversion through upconversion photoluminescence in nanoparticles. Another broad motivation for this is our bodies, most of the tissue and water, hemoglobin, melanin, everything is pretty transparent when it comes to this window of biological transparency between 800 and 1300 nanometers. But the photodetectors here are not quite efficient. They're more expensive than typical silicon photocells. So if there was a way to upconvert light that can simply be transmitted through, there would be a big motivation here to use this for facile bioimaging techniques. So how could it be done? This is just sort of a brief introduction on how I'm going to show you some of the strategies that we've tried to exploit in our lab. The idea is to create very simple but very scalable nanoscale plasmonic emitters or absorbers here that can focus light in 3 dimensions down to a tiny little mode volume. And we will have our upconverters sitting right here at the apex of these tips that can upconvert light very efficiently. Of course, there's a lot of different photophysical processes that even go before we can try to achieve this. So I'm going to talk all about all of them. The idea is to enhance sort of this nonlinear effect or this photon upconversion by orders of magnitude, specifically at low photon fluences. So let's start by this via a very simple approach. Again, this sounds very exotic, but it's an approach that was started off by a funding from Army back in 1940s or 50s, which is called Thermophotovoltaics. The idea is that you don't directly utilize this energetically broad distribution of sunlight. You simply absorb this in a secondary emitter or a selective emitter that takes all of this energy from sunlight and then re-emits this by getting hot, it re-emits this energy into an infrared photovoltaic cell. And since this emission can be matched to the band gap of this semiconductor photocell, in principle, this process can be very efficient. The thermodynamic upper limit for this efficiency is somewhere about 45 or 50%. But of course, that's never been achieved so far. And this approach has mainly been limited by this emitter material right here. It's fairly easy to absorb all of this energy and even store it as heat, as recently has been shown in some of the solar thermal emitters. The idea is, can we use some kind of a photonic or plasmonic structure as this new class of selective emitters that can allow this efficient thermophotovoltaic emission besides some of the photon upconversion applications that I'll talk about. So this would simply absorb the heat from sunlight and then re-emit this very selectively. And this can be very useful, not just for solar energy, but also waste heat energy applications. As I said, more than 8 terawatts of heat, more than 8 terawatts of energy that we actually consume is simply being radiated as heat. So these are sort of broad motivation slides. Let's talk about how we can actually try to achieve this and where does all of these fundamental photophysical processes come in. Some very simple thermal emission basics first. Gustav Kirchhoff back in 1800s showed us through very simple thought experiments that if you have a real body, a gray body, and in this cavity with a black body radiation, and both of them are at temperature T, the light emitted or the energy emitted would be simply the energy radiated, and this power emitted by this real body or the gray body would be a small fraction of the power emitted by this black body. So there would be an emissivity, but it will also absorb radiation from the black body. So very simply put, if you want to tune the emission of this thermal emitter, you simply have to tune the absorption, and the emission and the absorption are essentially equal. So if we want to tailor absorption, let's try to tailor thermal emission. So an idea, again, that became very popular back in 2000 and 2002 when the group from Sandia National Labs came up with these thermophotovoltaic emitters. It gained a lot of attention, where the idea was to write these log-pile-like structures in 3 dimensions that could be made of metal photonic crystals. Of course, the work at Sandia was done using e-beam lithography. The solution that we came up in our lab was to use a simple direct laser writing method, where you could use a tightly focused infrared lasers and use 2-photon photopolymerization essentially to write structures that you wanted in 3 dimensions. And then we had to come up with a new photoresist that basically could sustain very high temperatures, and then we coated these structures simply in the metal that we really wanted. And these were the metallic photonic crystals that can sustain very high temperatures. So the way we started about this is we made these structures, the fundamental structure by direct laser writing using silica coatings. So these structures are actually made of silica. Using direct laser writing, we came up with a new photoresist. You can read all about it in these papers. And as you can see, the fidelity of these structures back in 3 dimensions, you can see up to 8 layers, and they're perfectly aligned with exactly half a wavelength gap between these subsequent layers. And we confirmed this with multi-photon confocal microscopy. Then we coated these with the metal coatings that we wanted. Typical materials used were tungsten and molybdenum. And so this is an 8-layer tungsten woodpile-like structure. This is a 8-layer molybdenum structure. So they look good. Let's see how their optical properties actually shape up. If you look at absorption, or 1 minus reflectance, or the absorption for these metallic woodpiles, they have a band gap that was very well tuned to the band gap of germanium infrared photocell, or indium gallium arsenide photocells. So the band gap was here tuned right at 2 microns, so they can selectively emit light for this indium gallium arsenide or germanium photodetectors to absorb. And when we actually heated these structures at high temperatures, we were able to heat it to very high temperatures. We conducted this experiment at 650 degrees Celsius, and what we saw was a 32% conversion efficiency of heat into light. We didn't actually heat these out of sun, but we had a radiative heater that was heating these metal photonic crystals, and they were re-radiating the light into our indium gallium arsenide photocells. So what we showed, at least as a proof of concept, is you can break that 31% Shockley-Queisser limit by this very simple thermal to electricity conversion. although there were a number of problems that I'm going to talk about right now, which led us into trying to tailor these structures efficiently. All right. Sorry about this. So one of the main problems with this photovoltaic conversion was that since this was a 3D tungsten emitter or a thermal emitter, it was basically spraying photons in all 3 dimensions. So another fundamental problem that we had to overcome was, can we control not just the wavelength at which it's radiating, but also the directionality of this thermal emission, which really meant that we were trying to ask a very fundamental question: can we have sort of coherent directional thermal emission? Can we sort of have an infrared laser-like emission or a beaming emission from a hot metallic source? So this source was hot, and the photocell was always maintained at room temperature. So it was very useful to have the direction, the thermal emission being in the normal direction, so you can really keep them apart. Otherwise, you'd have to keep them very close. And this hot emitter was like at 650 or 1,000 degrees Celsius, and you had to maintain this photovoltaic emitter or the infrared absorber at room temperature. So the question we asked ourselves is, can we have coherent and directional thermal emission? Fortunately, the answer was yes, that there is no such roadblock when it comes to sort of fundamental physics. The answer that we came up with was to create these metallic grooves or bullseye-like structure here, which can simply be approximated as a lot of linear gratings that can provide momentum in different directions. So this as a first approximation, you can just approximate this as a series of linear gratings that are there in all dimensions. And this really means that while each thermal grating, when heated, basically sprays photons in all directions, it's more like a rainbow-like emission. When you combine all of these together, you get a single wavelength being emitted in the normal direction, and at with high degree of directionality. So this actually turned out to be true when we created these gratings. Not just theoretically, we actually confirmed this with experiment. When we created these metallic tungsten or molybdenum gratings and we heated them at 900 degrees Celsius, what we saw was a very sharp thermal emission. Now, nominally, something at 900 degrees Celsius would have a very broad band black body-like emission. Here, what you're seeing is just 100, 200 nanometer full width half maximum of this emission. And it's coming out, the light is coming out in a narrow cone of plus minus 0.05 degrees Celsius in degrees here. And in fact, if you misalign this by even a degree, you would see this sharp drop in thermal emission of this tungsten bullseye. So this was good, but when we compared this to our theoretical predictions, what we saw was that this emission was actually much, much broader than what we had predicted theoretically, both in dimensionality, in wavelength, and also in its angular dispersion. And when we compared, obviously, the coherence of an ideal tungsten grating, it was not quite as coherent compared to what we had observed in our experiments. So this led to a whole series of experiments in trying to correlate or study how to characterize surface plasmon polaritons and how quickly they dephase, and how can we make this emission much more coherent. And this led us to basically some problems that we uncovered back due to surface roughness in the experiment. So when we started this naively back in 2008, what we had expected is we had these perfectly structured tungsten gratings, which is what our scanning electron microscopes told us, and the surface plasmons were simply being generated on top of it. These are thermally generated plasmons. Typically, we use light to generate these surface plasmon polaritons, and they were just riding on top of these gratings and were being coupled out selectively here. But in reality, these grains were rough and polycrystalline. When we tried to make structures out of them, we had to etch them with focused ion beam, which actually accentuated this roughness dramatically. And in fact, when we tried to do any kind of etching, we ended up implanting ion impurities in these structures, which actually changed the refractive index of the material right here. And we don't really have tungsten or molybdenum quite there. We actually have ion impurities where most of the surface plasmon polaritons are lying. And this was a very general problem for plasmonics, at least for propagating surface plasmons, if not for localized surface plasmons. And so I showed you some of those pictures top up, and the surfaces look very smooth, but when you look at grazing angle, you can really see what I was talking about, that you have very rough silver films. When you try to pattern these structures, the roughness actually gets worse. And when you try to create these hot electron waves or surface plasmon polariton waves, they can get cooled very easily, or they'll dephase very easily via electron-phonon or scattering at these roughnesses. And they would simply be scattered as far-field radiation, which causes this incoherence in thermal emission that we saw. And we also uncovered some of the major loss mechanisms besides ohmic loss. So we can't really get rid of the ohmic losses completely without addition of energy. But this roughness scattering and grain boundary scattering was something that we were able to reduce substantially by using a very simple and scalable template stripping method. So here's the solution that we came up with. So this is all old news now. This was the solution we came up with in 2009, where we took these single crystalline silicon films and we patterned the structures that we really needed into silicon. Then we would put our noble metal films right on top of this. And then we would simply pour epoxy or use electroplating to make these films thicker so they could stand on their own. And then we could simply just peel it off, because these noble metals don't really adhere to silicon, so they just come right off with obviously exactly the fidelity that you started with, and the template was actually ready to be reused. All the ion implanted were actually in the silicon, and we didn't really have any additional roughness due to the fact that we were trying to etch single crystalline silicon and not something that was amorphous. So the silicon substrate is reusable. The roughness is extremely low. You can achieve, we've shown now that you can achieve almost 1-2 angstrom surface roughness with silicon, because these substrates are really flat, and any implanted ions are really avoided in these patterns. So what we showed was you can make these bullseyes, and they look smooth not just when you try to look at them top down, but also at grazing angle. You could see that these structures have excellent fidelity over very large areas. So that's all good. But we really wanted was the optical properties that we were looking for, and very long plasmon propagation lengths. So to characterize the propagation of surface plasmons, we created a whole series of slits and grooves. So we would propagate these plasmons by these nanoscale slits and then sort of scatter them off. Because they were so flat, we didn't really see any light emission from these. We'd have to create these nanoscale grooves or lines so we can scatter these plasmons at different lengths and see how far they were traveling when you try to create plasmons in visible wavelengths. So we created a whole series of them, and we used white light to characterize how far these plasmons were propagating. For conventional structures where there was roughness without template stripping, we could see about 2 to 10 microns plasmon propagation length, which wasn't very different from other results that were published using cathodoluminescence studies. But what we saw was, and this is on a log-log scale, we saw almost an order of magnitude, if not more, increase in plasmon propagation lengths with the simple template stripping method. In fact, when you compare it to the theoretical losses due to just ohmic losses in the metal itself, without any grain boundary or surface scattering, you can see that our measurements actually were very close to the ohmic losses that we expect in simple silver, gold, and copper metal films. So these plasmons were propagating as far as the metal would really allow them to. In fact, when we characterize sort of losses due to each one of these loss mechanisms separately, here the length, suppose the plasmons in total are propagating only 10 microns, we actually decoupled where these losses are coming in from, either ohmic losses or scattering losses, or by simple radiation into free space, and this was the total plasmon propagation length. As you can see, simple rough silver down at 500 nanometers would only give you 2 microns of plasmon propagation, whereas smooth silver would actually give you a 15 micron plasmon propagation length. And you could see that scattering and radiative losses are almost virtually eliminated. If it was just radiation or scattering, you would have almost millimeter length scale plasmon propagation. But we know that the ohmic losses are there, and they form a substantial part of this. But the good part that we didn't really expect at that time was that even the ohmic losses were strongly reduced, and we showed that this really happens because of the annealing, that you're increasing grain sizes and you're even reducing this ohmic losses in the metal. A similar result was seen for gold too, where the plasmon propagation length was increased, but mainly because again, the scattering and radiation were not big loss mechanisms, but the grain boundary scattering in these tiny little 40, 50 nanometer gold grains was. So this can have important applications, as we showed, not only for plasmonics, but also for metamaterials. So you can create sort of a variety of interesting structures. I'll show you some of them for these applications. But another question that had always been cropping up in our mind is, so we could do this with propagating surface plasmons. What happens when you try to create these surface plasmons in tiny little nanoscale particles? So here I'm showing you examples from copper, because gold and silver nanoparticles have been studied extensively, and a lot of these mechanisms have been shown in gold and silver. However, copper, in our mind, is a very important material, or could be a very important plasmonic material that has been understudied. It has very high conductivity when you just look at losses due to the metal. It has conductivity comparable to those of gold and silver, and its cost is very low compared to gold and silver. But the disadvantage with copper, and why most people try not to use them, is because they're not very stable. They oxidize very quickly in the ambient atmosphere, and there's not much photophysics that's known for these copper nanoparticles. So the first problem, which was important one to cross before we could even go to the photophysical properties of these copper nanostructures, was to solve the problem of their chemical instability. So we did chemical vapor atomic layer deposition, where we coated these copper nanoparticles with alumina layers so we could make them stable and be actually able to heat them at high temperatures for some of these studies. So without any ALD coating, you can see that the copper nanoparticles oxidize very easily. They turn into copper oxide, so you can see this plasmon peak completely dissipating, even when you try to keep these in a test tube, and you're not really supplying oxygen. So this copper plasmon was not really stable. The moment you coat them with ALD coatings, you can heat them up to 300, 350 degrees Celsius in an ambient atmosphere, and these plasmons are very stable. Of course, the width of this plasmon has changed a little bit, that I'll talk to you about in just a second. And the other important aspect of this was these alumina layers, the ALD coating layers, were not very thick, and we could still see this refractive index sensing that we could see even after almost 50 layers of alumina. So it wasn't like that the plasmon was not really accessible to anything that we would coat outside these copper nanoparticles. They were stable, and the plasmon was still accessible, so we could do even refractive index sensing or surface enhanced Raman scattering with these. What we tried was obviously trying to see what the effect of these different photophysical mechanisms are in these. We could heat these now all the way to 600 degrees or 350 degrees Celsius, and we could obviously chill them down to a 4 Kelvin helium cryostat. So we saw very striking results that I'll try to summarize very quickly in a whole series of different copper nanoparticles that we synthesized in this experiments. If you just look at different sizes, what we saw both with single nanoparticle spectroscopy, so you saw a lot of that today, where you could take individual nanoparticles and try to study them, or with an ensemble analysis, what we really saw was there wasn't much difference between the plasmon dephasing. So here, the plasmons cannot travel tens or hundreds of microns. They will just scatter back and forth, and the way to quantify how long these plasmons can live is to look at their plasmon dephasing time. So once you launch a surface plasmon polariton, they would just go back and forth by scattering on the surface, and they will live for a very long time. So over here, what I showed here is that the plasmons in the 7.5 nanometer copper nanoparticles live up to 29 femtoseconds, and these bigger 11 or 12 nanometer copper nanoparticles, they would live for 28.3 femtoseconds. So the plasmon dephasing time was not that different between these nanoparticles. So again, we try to quantify each and every single loss mechanism in these. You can read all about it in this paper. The dominant effects that we looked at was just electron-electron scattering or electron-phonon scattering. For copper, interband absorption is very important. We looked at surface scattering because, as I said, we did suspect that the surfaces were not playing a big role because the photophysics was very similar, but we still had to verify that. The effects due to inhomogeneous linewidth broadening or defect scattering on the surfaces. So we analyzed all of this. I'll just summarize them very quickly. What we really saw was in propagating surface plasmons, we saw a lot of effect coming in from grain boundaries and roughness because these nanoparticles were smoother and there was no grain boundaries to speak of in these 8 or 10 nanometer copper nanoparticles. What we saw were that the electron-phonon effects were very dominant when you compare them to surface scattering or other defect scattering mechanisms. We had to plot them on separate scales to even see them on similar time scales. As you could see, the inverse of the lifetime, which really corresponds to how dominant this mechanism is, the electron-phonon scattering was almost an order of magnitude more dominant than just electron-electron or surface scattering in these smaller and larger nanoparticles. So it was very important to think constantly about how to tune these electron-phonon interactions in these. We also showed that these nanoparticles, even when coated with ALD, can be extremely useful both for refractive index sensing and surface-enhanced Raman scattering, and also for catalytic processes that you can read about in this. So now I'll come back to the original task very quickly and try to summarize some of the results that we saw. So once we understood how to sort of increase or improve the design and lifetime of these surface plasmon polaritons and how to do this three-dimensional plasmonic nanofocusing with good efficiencies, we created these structures. And you can make very interesting and fancy structures by simply KOH, by simple anisotropic KOH etching, and then basically making these gratings on top of these structures to sort of tune how your nanofocused plasmonic hotspot looks like. And just by themselves, so these are results in gold. Gold by itself is not a very good nonlinear optical material, but you could see significant second harmonic generation from this in gold. And when you combine this with some of these upconversion photoluminescence nanoparticles. So these are some lanthanide nanoparticles. I'm not going to go into detail because I could see I'm running out of time here. If you take some of these lanthanide doped nanoparticles that can absorb infrared radiation and basically take a couple of these infrared photons to kick up or create these electron hole pairs in these lanthanide dopants, you can get, simply by using infrared light, you can get either green or red light emission in these upconverting nanoparticles. And this is simply called photon upconversion by upconversion photoluminescence. When we create a whole series of these, so you can get a different light output from these, and we put them on top of these very well-designed plasmonic nanopyramids. So these are our nanopyramids that were designed with 2 micron periodicity, so they would be resonant at 1 micron. So this is the Plasmon and the gold pyramids. When we put these upconversion nanoparticles right on top, what we could really see is very high visible emission with these fluorophores that were sitting right at the apex of the tip, and almost no emission if the fluorophore was sitting down at the bottom because of this very strong quenching that we see between the lanthanide dopant and the flat metal surface. So we decouple the photophysics. You can actually see this with a infrared LED. You don't really need to turn up your laser powers to see this because it's very easy to just increase the infrared laser power and get very efficient photon upconversion. But what we tried to do was really turn the dial down since sun is not an infrared laser light source. And we could see very efficient green and red emission coming in from these. The actual emission enhancements was several hundred to 1,000. I'm not going to talk about this. I'm just going to talk about very quickly a few photophysical steps. So the electromagnetic field intensity, which was the weak Purcell type effect, was enhanced by a modest 5-fold. So it wasn't the best plasmon enhancement by a simple antenna effect. But what really surprised us was even the energy transfer rate, which is very difficult to enhance beyond the nominal value, was enhanced by 6-fold over its flat counterpart. And the quenching, which was not surprising, was strongly enhanced on flat portions of these plasmonic nanopyramids by 14-fold. So what we really showed was that you can have very strong Coulombic interactions, especially when you are in the strong coupling regime, not very weak coupling where you can get any number that you're looking for. But even in strong coupling, you can get strong Coulombic interactions, which can enhance near field effects. You can have very strongly enhanced nonlinear optics, which could lead to useful applications in solar energy. And tomorrow I'm going to talk about some of the nanoscale diagnostic and therapeutic applications. But what we also provided in this process was very detailed insights into these electron-phonon, and this defect-mediated plasmon dephasing. So with that, I'd like to stop here by thanking, obviously, the funding agencies that made all of this work possible, and my group that did most of the work. And thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take questions.